The night my neighbor quietly asked me if everything was all right at my house, I realized the sounds weren't only in my head. It happened on a Tuesday evening. A quiet one. The kind where the street settles early and the porch lights glow like small, patient stars. I was standing at my mailbox when Dakota Whittaker from across the street slowed his walk. Dakota was the kind of neighbor who believed in polite distance. We waved. Sometimes we spoke about the weather or the mail being late again, nothing deeper than that. So when he stopped beside my driveway and cleared his throat, I immediately knew something was unusual. "In Berlin," he said softly, adjusting the collar of his jacket, "I hope you don't mind me asking something." I smiled the way neighbors do when they expect a simple question. "Of course not, Dakota." He hesitated, then he leaned a little closer, lowering his voice. "Everything all right at your house lately?" For a moment I didn't answer. A faint breeze moved through the maple tree in my yard. The leaves rustled like quiet whispers. "Why do you ask?" I said. Dakota rubbed the back of his neck, suddenly looking embarrassed. Well, I wasn't sure if it was my place to say anything. He paused. "But the past few nights I've heard some strange noises coming from your backyard." The words settled slowly in my chest. Because for the past 2 weeks I had been hearing them too. Footsteps, not loud ones, not hurried, just slow, deliberate steps on gravel, always after midnight, always in the backyard. I forced a small laugh. "Oh, that," I said, "probably raccoons." Dakota studied my face for a moment longer than usual, then he nodded politely. "Maybe so," he said. "Just thought I should check." He tipped his cap slightly and continued down the sidewalk. I watched him disappear past the streetlight. And for the first time, I realized something that made my stomach tighten. If Dakota had heard those footsteps, then they were real. My name is Berlin Caldwell. I'm 56 years old, and until recently my life had been as quiet and predictable as the ticking clock in my kitchen. I had lived in the same small house on Linden Street for nearly 30 years. My husband Thomas and I bought it when our son Corbin was just 4 years old. Back then, the paint was fresh, the yard was bare dirt, and the future felt wide and open. Thomas passed away 7 years ago, heart attack, quick, sudden. One ordinary morning that turned into a silence I still carry. After that, the house became quieter than I ever imagined it could be. Corbin moved to Seattle for work not long after. He called every Sunday, just like he promised. But phone calls aren't the same as footsteps in the hallway. So my days became simple routines. Morning coffee by the kitchen window, watering the rose bushes Thomas planted, walking to the corner market for bread and milk. Evenings were the quietest part. I'd make a small dinner, usually soup or something warm, and sit at the table with the radio humming softly. Sometimes the loneliness would creep in like cold air through a cracked window, but I managed. You learn how to live with quiet, at least I thought I had. The first time I heard the footsteps, I almost ignored them. It was late, around 1 in the morning. I had woken up to get a glass of water. As I passed the back door, I heard something outside. Crunch, crunch, slow steps on gravel. I froze. At first I assumed it was an animal. We get raccoons sometimes, occasionally a stray cat, but animals move differently. They scurry, they rustle. These footsteps were steady, measured, like someone walking slowly across the yard. I held my breath and listened. Crunch, crunch, then silence. I turned on the porch light and peeked through the curtain. The yard was empty. The wooden fence stood still in the yellow glow of the bulb. Nothing moved. I told myself I was imagining things. Grief does strange things to the mind. Sometimes the quiet makes ordinary sounds feel bigger than they are, so I went back to bed. But the next night it happened again, and the night after that, always around midnight or later, always the same slow footsteps. Never voices, never shadows. Just the sound of someone walking across my gravel path behind the house. After a week, I stopped mentioning it even to myself. Instead, I began doing small things, checking the back door twice before bed, closing the curtains more carefully, leaving the porch light on all night. Little habits that made the house feel safer, but the footsteps continued, and each night they felt a little closer. The strange thing was that nothing in the yard ever seemed disturbed. The gate stayed locked, the flower beds looked untouched, even the gravel path remained smooth. Which made me question my own ears, until Dakota spoke to me, standing there by the mailbox, confirming the one thing I had tried not to believe. Someone else had heard it too. That night the house felt different, not dangerous exactly, just aware. Like the walls were holding their breath. I double-checked every lock before going to bed. Front door, back door, windows, everything was secure. Still, sleep came slowly. Around midnight, the clock in the hallway chimed softly. I lay there in the dark, staring at the ceiling, waiting. For a long time, nothing happened. I began to relax. Maybe Dakota had been mistaken. Maybe the sounds had stopped. Then crunch. The sound came from outside, soft, unhurried. A single step on gravel. My heart started pounding. Crunch, another step closer this time. I slid quietly out of bed. The wooden floor felt cold beneath my feet. Moving slowly, I walked down the hallway toward the kitchen. The footsteps continued. Whoever it was, they were walking along the back path, right beside the house. I reached the kitchen door and rested my hand on the wall. The porch light was already on, which meant if someone was out there, they would be visible. The footsteps stopped. Silence filled the air so completely I could hear the faint hum of the refrigerator. I swallowed. Then slowly, I pulled the curtain aside. And what I saw in the backyard made my breath catch in my throat, because the gate at the back fence was slowly swinging open. The gate was moving, not fast, not violently, just a slow, quiet swing as if someone had pushed it a moment earlier. For several seconds, I couldn't move. The porch light spread across the gravel path, touching the wooden fence, the old garden bench Thomas had built years ago, and the small patch of roses near the corner. But no one was there, only the gate gently creaking. I opened the back door just an inch. The night air slipped into the kitchen, cool and faintly damp with the smell of soil and leaves. "Hello?" I said. My voice sounded smaller than I expected. No answer. The gate stopped moving. I stepped onto the porch. The boards creaked beneath my feet, loud in the silence. "Is someone there?" Still nothing. The yard looked exactly as it always did. Quiet, orderly, ordinary, but something about the open gate unsettled me. I knew I had locked it earlier that evening. I always did. It had become a habit after Thomas passed away. I walked slowly toward it. Every step across the gravel seemed louder than the last. Crunch, crunch, the same sound I had been hearing every night. And suddenly, standing there in the dark, I understood exactly what Dakota had been hearing from across the street. When I reached the gate, I looked beyond it. The alley behind the house stretched empty in both directions. Just a narrow strip of pavement lined with fences and dim porch lights from neighboring homes. No footsteps, no shadows, no one running away, only silence. I checked the latch. It hung loose, unlocked. A strange chill moved through me because I remembered clearly fastening it earlier that evening. I stood there for another minute, listening. Nothing. Finally, I closed the gate and secured the latch again. Then I returned to the house, locking the back door firmly behind me. Sleep didn't come easily after that. Every creak in the house sounded suspicious. Every passing car felt like a warning, but eventually exhaustion pulled me under. The next morning, the sunlight made everything seem almost ridiculous. The yard looked perfectly peaceful. The roses glowed pink in the soft light. Birds hopped across the fence like tiny inspectors of the morning. If someone had truly been in the yard, there should have been signs, footprints, disturbed gravel, something, but there was nothing unusual. I stood at the back window with my coffee, studying the ground carefully. Everything looked untouched, which made the entire experience feel strangely unreal. Still, Dakota's words echoed in my mind. "I've heard some strange noises coming from your backyard." Later that afternoon, I saw him again. He was watering the hydrangeas along his front porch. When he noticed me walking toward the mailbox, he lifted a hand. "Afternoon, in Berlin. Afternoon, Dakota." I hesitated for a moment, then walked across the street. "I wanted to ask you something," I said. He turned off the hose. "Of course. Those noises you mentioned, when did you first hear them?" Dakota thought for a moment. "About a week ago," he said. "Maybe a little more." My stomach tightened. That matched exactly when I had first noticed the footsteps. "Did you ever see anyone?" I asked. "No," he replied, "just the sounds." He studied my expression carefully. "Have you seen something?" I shook my head. "Just the gate moving last night." Dakota's brow creased slightly. "Moving?" "It was open when I checked." He folded his arms, thinking. "Well," he said after a moment, "sometimes kids sneak through the alleys at night. Could be teenagers cutting through yards." I wanted to believe that. Teenagers, that sounded ordinary, harmless, but something about the footsteps hadn't felt careless or hurried. They had been too slow, too deliberate. Still, I nodded politely. "You're probably right." Dakota smiled gently. "If it keeps happening, you might consider installing a motion light back there." "That's a good idea," I said. But even as I walked back toward my house, something inside me remained uneasy. The following 2 nights were quiet, no footsteps, no moving gate. I began to relax. Maybe Dakota had been right, maybe it had been nothing more than someone cutting through the alley. By the third evening, the tension had faded enough that I almost forgot about it. I spent that night baking a small apple pie. It had been Thomas's favorite. The kitchen filled with the warm scent of cinnamon and butter, and for a while the house felt the way it used to, comfortable, familiar. I even called Corbin that evening. "How's my favorite mother?" he asked in his cheerful voice. "I'm your only mother," I replied. "That's why you're my favorite?" We talked about his job, the rainy Seattle weather, and the neighbor's dog that kept stealing his newspaper. I didn't mention the footsteps. There was no reason to worry him about something that had probably already ended. After the call, I washed the dishes and turned off the kitchen lights. By 11, the house was dark. Midnight came quietly. I slept deeply until the sound woke me again. Crunch. My eyes opened instantly. For a moment I stayed completely still, listening. The sound came again. Crunch. Exactly the same as before, slow, careful, right outside the house. My heart began to beat faster. But this time something was different. There were 2 sets of footsteps, one slightly heavier than the other. I sat up in bed. The footsteps moved across the gravel path behind the kitchen. Then they stopped. I slid out of bed and moved toward the hallway. The house was silent except for the faint ticking of the wall clock. When I reached the kitchen door, I paused. The porch light was on again, but the curtain was closed. I hesitated before touching it. Then I slowly pulled it aside. 2 figures stood in the backyard, both men. One was tall and thin, the other shorter and heavier. They were standing near the garden bench Thomas had built, not speaking, just looking toward the house. My breath caught. Because the taller man lifted his hand and pointed directly at the back door. The shorter one nodded. I stepped away from the window immediately, my heart racing. They knew someone was inside. They knew I was watching. 1,000 thoughts rushed through my mind. Should I call the police? Should I turn off the lights? Should I pretend the house was empty? Before I could decide, I heard something that made my blood run cold. The faint metallic rattle of the gate latch, then footsteps, approaching the back porch. Slow, deliberate, and stopping right outside my door. The footsteps stopped right outside my back door. For a moment, the entire house felt frozen in place. I stood in the kitchen, my hand pressed against the edge of the counter, barely breathing. On the other side of that thin wooden door, 2 strangers stood in my backyard. And they knew someone was inside. The porch light cast a soft yellow glow through the curtain. I could see the faint outline of their shadows shifting against the fabric. Neither of them knocked. Neither of them spoke. They just stood there, waiting. My mind began to race through possibilities. Burglars, teenagers, someone who had mistaken the house for another. But something about the way they had moved, slow, patient, deliberate, didn't feel like ordinary trespassing. After what felt like a full minute, one of them shifted his weight. The porch boards creaked softly. Then I heard a low voice. "Doesn't look like anyone's coming." The other man responded in an even quieter tone. "Lights were on earlier. Maybe she went to bed." The word struck me like a small hammer against my ribs. They knew someone lived here. They knew it was a woman. My fingers tightened around the edge of the counter. The first man sighed. "Well, we'll come back tomorrow." Tomorrow, the porch creaked again as they stepped away. Their footsteps crossed the gravel path. Crunch, crunch, then the faint click of the gate. Silence returned to the yard. But I stayed exactly where I was for several minutes, listening carefully. No voices, no footsteps, nothing. Finally, I walked slowly to the back door and looked through the curtain. The yard was empty again, just the quiet fence, the garden bench, the roses swaying slightly in the night breeze. But this time, something had changed inside me, because those men had not wandered into my yard by accident. They had come for a reason, and they had expected me. I didn't sleep again that night. Instead, I sat at the kitchen table with the porch light glowing outside and a cup of tea slowly going cold in my hands. Every sound made me glance toward the door. A passing car, a dog barking somewhere down the street, even the wind brushing the fence. By morning, exhaustion had settled heavily into my shoulders, but the fear remained. At 8 o'clock, I stepped outside to check the yard. The gravel path looked the same as always. No clear footprints, no broken plants. The gate was closed again. But the latch hung slightly crooked as if someone had handled it recently. I stared at it for a long moment. Then I went back inside and picked up the phone. I called Corbin. He answered on the third ring. "Hey, Mom." His voice carried the usual warmth, but I could hear the background hum of an office behind him. "Corbin," I said carefully, "I need to ask you something." "Sure, everything okay? I think someone's been coming into the backyard at night." There was a short pause. "What do you mean?" I explained the footsteps, the moving gate, the two men standing outside the house. Corbin listened quietly. When I finished, he spoke in a calmer voice than I expected. "Mom, are you sure they weren't just passing through the alley?" "They came onto the porch," I said. That made him pause again. "Did they try to break in?" "No." "Did they knock?" "No." Another pause, then he sighed softly. "I don't like that," he said. "Neither do I." "Did you call the police?" "Not yet. You probably should." I knew he was right, but something inside me hesitated, because I kept replaying that quiet sentence in my mind. Lights were on earlier. Those men had been watching the house, at least for a little while, maybe longer. "I'll think about it," I said. Corbin's voice softened. "Mom, maybe you should stay with a neighbor tonight." I glanced through the kitchen window toward Dakota's house across the street. "No," I said quietly. "I'll be all right." After we hung up, I locked the doors again. Even though it was morning, even though the sun was bright, the house no longer felt quite as safe as it once had. That afternoon, Dakota knocked on my front door. I opened it with some surprise. "Hello, in Berlin," he said, holding his hat in his hands. "Hello, Dakota." He looked slightly uncomfortable. "I hope I'm not bothering you." "Not at all," he hesitated. "I noticed your porch light was on most of the night." I nodded slowly. "Did you hear the footsteps again?" He sighed. "Yes." My stomach tightened. "Did you see anything?" "Two men walking down the alley around midnight," he said. "They came from the direction of your house." That confirmed it. I stepped aside so he could come in. We sat at the kitchen table. The same place where I had spent the night staring at the dark window. Dakota listened carefully as I described what I had seen. When I finished, he leaned back in his chair. "That doesn't sound like teenagers," he said. "No," I agreed. He rubbed his chin thoughtfully. "You might want to report this." I was thinking about it. "Better safe than sorry," I nodded. But even as we spoke, another thought kept pressing quietly into my mind. Those men had said something else. "We'll come back tomorrow." That meant tonight. They were planning to return, and the idea of waiting for them again filled me with a quiet, growing dread. Dakota stood up after a few minutes. "If you hear anything tonight," he said, "call me." "Thank you." He walked toward the door, then paused. "One more thing." "Yes," he looked slightly uncertain. "Last night when they were leaving the alley, I heard one of them say something." "What?" Dakota frowned slightly as he tried to remember. "I'm not sure I heard it correctly," he said, "but it sounded like he said." He hesitated. "That's the house Corbin told us about." The room suddenly felt very still. My heart skipped. "Corbin?" I said slowly. Dakota nodded. "That's what I thought I heard." My mind raced immediately. There had to be a mistake. Corbin lived 2,000 miles away. He had never even met these men. He had no reason to send anyone to my house. Still, the words settled heavily in the air between us. "The house Corbin told us about." Dakota noticed my expression. "I'm probably mistaken," he said quickly. It was dark. They were far away. I forced a small smile. "Yes, probably." But after Dakota left, I stood alone in the quiet kitchen for a long time, thinking, trying to understand. Because suddenly the situation felt far more complicated than two strangers wandering into my yard. And for the first time since the footsteps had started, a small, uncomfortable doubt began to form in my mind. After Dakota left, the house felt heavier than it had before. The quiet was no longer peaceful. It felt like something waiting. I stood at the kitchen window for a long time, staring at the backyard gate. The sunlight lay across the gravel path exactly the way it had every morning for nearly 30 years. Everything looked normal. But Dakota's words wouldn't leave my mind. "That's the house Corbin told us about." I kept trying to explain it away. Maybe Dakota had misheard. Maybe the man had said manual or annual or something that only sounded like Corbin. But the more I tried to dismiss it, the more unsettled I felt. Corbin had always been a thoughtful son, quiet like his father. Responsible. Even after moving to Seattle, he never forgot to call. Birthdays, holidays, Sundays, he always remembered. So the idea that he had anything to do with strangers appearing in my backyard felt impossible. Still, the words echoed. By mid-afternoon, I had convinced myself there must be a reasonable explanation. So I called him again. He answered more quickly this time. "Hey Mom, everything okay?" His tone was light, but something in his voice sounded slightly distracted. I wanted to ask you something, I said. Sure. Have you talked to anyone recently about the house? The house. He repeated, yes. There was a small pause. What do you mean, just anyone who might have asked about it? I could hear papers shifting on his desk. No, he said. Why? I hesitated before answering. Dakota said he overheard one of the men last night. Another pause. What did he say? That it was the house Corbin told them about. For a moment the line went completely silent, then Corbin laughed softly. Mom, that doesn't make any sense. I know. I haven't told anyone about your house. You're sure? Of course I'm sure. His answer came quickly, almost too quickly, but I pushed the thought aside. I probably misunderstood, I said. Yeah, he replied gently. Sounds like someone's imagination running wild. His calm tone helped ease the tension in my chest. Maybe so. Still, Corbin continued, if those guys show up again, you should call the police. I will. After we hung up, I felt a little better, but not completely. Something about that brief silence before Corbin's answer lingered in my mind. Still, I told myself not to read too much into it. Even good people pause sometimes when they're surprised. That evening, the house seemed to listen. Every room felt alert. The shadows stretched longer across the hallway as the sun went down. By 8 o'clock, I had locked every door again. I even moved one of the kitchen chairs against the back door, not because it would stop someone determined to enter, but because it made me feel less exposed. Across the street, Dakota's porch light flicked on. That small square of light gave me a little comfort. At least someone else was awake nearby. I made myself a simple dinner, toast and scrambled eggs, but I barely tasted it. My mind kept drifting toward midnight. Because that was when they had come before. At 11:30, I turned off the television. The house became very quiet again. The clock ticked steadily on the living room wall. 11:45, 11:50. I sat in the kitchen with the lights off, watching the faint glow of the porch light outside, waiting. By midnight, nothing had happened. My shoulders began to loosen slightly. Maybe they weren't coming back after all. Maybe last night had been the end of it. Midnight passed. 12:10. 12:15. The yard remained empty. I finally allowed myself to breathe a little easier. Then, at 12:22, crunch. The sound came suddenly, sharp and unmistakable. Footsteps on gravel. I froze in my chair. Another step followed, crunch, then another, the same slow rhythm as before. Someone was walking through my backyard again. My pulse began pounding in my ears. This time I didn't go to the window immediately. Instead, I listened. 2 sets of footsteps again, one heavier, one lighter. They moved across the yard, stopping near the bench. Then one of the men spoke. His voice was clearer this time. Lights are off tonight. The second man replied, maybe she's asleep, or maybe she called someone. A pause followed. The gravel shifted again as one of them moved. Well, we won't know unless we check. My breath caught. The footsteps began moving toward the porch again. Slow, unhurried, I stood up quietly. Every instinct told me not to confront them, not alone. Instead, I reached for the phone on the kitchen counter. My hands trembled slightly as I dialed, but before I could press the final number, something unexpected happened outside. A voice called from the street. Hey, it was Dakota, loud, firm, direct. The footsteps outside stopped instantly. What are you doing back there? Dakota shouted. The 2 men muttered something I couldn't understand. Then the gravel erupted into fast movement. Running. Footsteps rushed toward the alley. The gate slammed open. By the time I reached the window, they were already disappearing down the dark path behind the houses. Dakota stood near the sidewalk, his porch light behind him like a small lighthouse. He looked toward my backyard. I stepped outside onto the porch. Thank you, I said, my voice still shaking slightly. He crossed the street. I figured they'd come back tonight, he said. How did you know? He shrugged. Just a feeling. We stood in the quiet yard together. The night air felt cooler than before. Did you recognize them? He asked. No, he nodded thoughtfully, then he glanced toward the garden bench. That's odd. What is? Dakota pointed. Something small lay on the bench, a folded piece of paper. Neither of us had seen it there before. I walked over slowly. The paper looked clean and new, carefully folded in half. I picked it up. Inside was a short message written in dark blue ink, just one sentence. Tell Corbin we're still waiting. The words seemed to tighten the air around us. Dakota read them over my shoulder, his expression darkened. In Berlin, he said quietly, I think it's time you called your son again. I stared at the message in my hands, and for the first time since the strange noises began. A cold, unsettling question formed clearly in my mind. What exactly had Corbin told these men? I stood there in the backyard holding the note while Dakota watched quietly beside me. The words were simple. Tell Corbin we're still waiting. Nothing threatening, nothing aggressive. And somehow that made it feel worse, because whoever those men were, they believed I was connected to whatever Corbin had promised them. Dakota rubbed his chin thoughtfully. Those men weren't just wandering around, he said. No, I replied softly. They came here with a purpose. The night air felt cooler against my skin now, like the temperature had dropped without warning. I folded the note carefully and slipped it into my sweater pocket. I'm calling Corbin, I said. Dakota nodded. That's a good idea. When I stepped back inside the house, my hands felt steadier than before, not calmer, but clearer. Fear had slowly been replaced by something else, a need to understand. I dialed Corbin's number again. It rang longer this time. Finally, he answered. Hey, Mom, he said, sounding slightly tired. Everything all right? I didn't ease into the conversation. Corbin, I said quietly, 2 men were in the backyard again tonight. His voice sharpened immediately. They came back, yes. Did they try to break in? No. What did they do? I took the folded note from my pocket and opened it slowly, even though he couldn't see me. They left a message. Silence filled the line. What kind of message? He asked. I read the sentence aloud. Tell Corbin we're still waiting. The quiet that followed was heavier than any silence we had shared before. Corbin, I said. He exhaled slowly. That doesn't make sense, he replied. His voice sounded careful now, too careful. You've said that already, I said gently, but someone clearly thinks you know them. I don't. Then why would they leave your name? I don't know. Another pause, longer this time. I waited. Eventually he spoke again. Mom, maybe it's a scam or something. A scam? Yeah, people do weird things sometimes. I sat down slowly at the kitchen table. Corbin, I said quietly, have you told anyone about selling this house? His response came quickly. No, you're sure? Yes, because those men seem to think something has been promised to them. The line went silent again. And this time the silence stretched long enough that I began to hear the faint sound of traffic behind him. Finally he spoke. Mom, I need to ask you something. What? Have you been feeling all right lately? The question landed heavily. Yes, I said slowly. I mean, sometimes when people live alone for a long time, they start hearing things or worrying about things that aren't really there. My grip tightened slightly around the phone. Dakota heard them too, I said. Another pause, then Corbin sighed. Okay, he said. I'm not saying you imagined it, but you're thinking it. I'm just trying to understand. So am I. The calm in my voice surprised even me. For a long moment, neither of us spoke. Then Corbin cleared his throat. Listen, he said. Maybe I should fly out there for a few days. That suggestion sounded reasonable, caring, but something about the timing felt strange. You want to come now? I asked. Well, yeah, if people are showing up at the house, I should probably check things out. His words sounded responsible, but they didn't sound surprised anymore, and that quiet shift unsettled me more than anything else had tonight. All right, I said. I'll look at flights tomorrow, he replied. After we hung up, I remained at the table for several minutes. The kitchen clock ticked softly on the wall. Outside, the yard was quiet again, but the note lay open in front of me. Tell Corbin we're still waiting. The sentence didn't sound like a threat. It sounded like an unfinished arrangement. The next morning, I walked across the street to Dakota's house. He was already outside trimming his hedges. Morning, in Berlin, morning. I handed him the note again. He read it slowly. Still waiting, he murmured. Yes, that suggests an agreement of some kind. That's what I thought. He handed the paper back. What did Corbin say? He says he doesn't know anything about it. Dakota nodded slowly. Maybe he doesn't, but sometimes people promise things they shouldn't. The sentence lingered in the air between us. I looked down the quiet street. Children rode bicycles 2 houses away. A delivery truck rolled past the corner. Everything about the neighborhood felt ordinary, which made the situation feel even more out of place. Corbin said he might fly out here, I added. That's good, Dakota replied. Better to sort things out face to face. I nodded, but inside my thoughts were beginning to shift. Because the more I replayed our conversation from last night, the more Corbin's voice had sounded like someone trying to control a situation, not someone discovering a problem for the first time. That afternoon, I decided to do something I had not done in months. I opened the small filing cabinet in the hallway. Inside were the household documents Thomas and I had kept organized for years: property papers, insurance policies, bank statements, the simple records of a long, quiet life. I pulled out the folder labeled House Documents. The deed was still there, my name printed clearly across the page. Everything looked normal. But as I continued flipping through the papers, something caught my eye: a photocopy of a document I didn't remember seeing before. At the top were the words, "Property Inquiry Request." Below it was an email printout from 3 months earlier. The message had been sent from Corbin's email address. My chest tightened as I read the short note attached. Just gathering some information about the property value and potential buyers in the area. Beneath the message was the name of a small real estate investment company, a company located in Seattle, and at the bottom of the page had 2 handwritten names. The same 2 men I had seen standing in my backyard. I sat very still in the hallway chair, the paper trembling slightly in my hands. Corbin had not lied completely, but he had not told me the truth either. He had contacted people about the house. People who now believed something had been promised to them, and suddenly the strange footsteps in the yard made a terrible kind of sense. Those men weren't prowlers, they were waiting for something Corbin had led them to expect. But what, and why had he never told me? That evening, as the sun began to set behind the houses, I placed the document back into the folder. Then I sat at the kitchen table again. The note lay beside the phone, the same quiet sentence staring up at me: "Tell Corbin we're still waiting." I no longer needed to wonder what it meant, but I still didn't know the full story, and I had a feeling Corbin would arrive soon, ready to explain things his way. The question was whether he would tell me the truth, or whether I would have to uncover it myself. The house felt different after I found that document, not frightening, just honest in a way it hadn't been before. For the first time since the footsteps began, the pieces of the puzzle were starting to form a shape. Corbin had contacted a real estate investment company. 2 men connected to that company had been standing in my backyard, and they believed they were waiting for something, probably a decision, probably about this house. I sat at the kitchen table for a long time that evening, looking around the room Thomas and I had built our life in. The wooden cabinets he had installed himself. The scratch in the floor where Corbin had dragged his toy truck when he was 6. The window where the afternoon sunlight always settled. This house wasn't just a property. It was 30 years of mornings, dinners, arguments, laughter, and quiet days. So the idea that someone might have been discussing its future without me left a tight ache in my chest. But I didn't feel angry yet, just unsettled. Corbin's flight arrived the next afternoon. Dakota offered to drive me to the airport, but I told him I preferred to go alone. I wanted to see Corbin's face the moment we spoke. Some truths appear there before words are even spoken. When I reached the arrivals gate, he was already walking toward me with his usual quick stride. He looked the same, tall like his father, dark hair beginning to gray slightly at the temples. For a moment I saw the same boy who used to run across the yard chasing a red ball. He smiled when he saw me. "Mom," we hugged, and for a brief moment the situation felt normal again. "Long flight?" I asked. "Not too bad." On the drive home, we talked about small things: the weather, his job, the restaurant that had closed on Main Street. But beneath the conversation, I could feel the real subject waiting quietly between us. When we arrived at the house, Corbin stepped out of the car and looked around the yard. The gate, the gravel path, the bench, exactly the places where the strangers had stood. "Where did you see them?" he asked. "Back here." I walked him around to the backyard. He studied the area carefully, then he turned toward the fence and the alley beyond it. "They came through there?" "Yes." Corbin nodded slowly, then he sighed. "Well," he said, "it looks like a normal yard to me." I studied his face. There was something in his expression I hadn't seen before. Not fear, not confusion, more like someone quietly measuring a situation. "Corbin," I said gently, "we need to talk inside." He didn't argue. Inside the kitchen, the air felt heavier. He sat at the table while I poured 2 cups of coffee, then I placed the folded note in front of him. He read it carefully. "Tell Corbin we're still waiting." His jaw tightened slightly. "Where did they leave this?" "On the garden bench." He exhaled slowly. "That's strange." I watched him for another moment, then I reached into the hallway and brought the document from the filing cabinet. The property inquiry request. I placed it beside the note. Corbin's eyes moved to the paper, and for the first time since arriving, he looked genuinely uncomfortable. "Mom," he said quietly, "where did you get this?" "It was in the house documents." He leaned back in the chair, his shoulders sank slightly. "I was hoping you wouldn't find that." The sentence hung in the air. "You didn't tell me," I said. "I was planning to." "When?" Corbin rubbed his forehead. "I don't know when the timing felt right." "The timing for what?" He hesitated, then he spoke slowly. "I've been looking into selling the house." The words landed with a soft heaviness, not shocking but painful. "Without asking me?" "I wasn't selling it yet," he said quickly. "I was just exploring options." "Why?" Corbin looked down at the table. "Mom, you're living here alone. I know, this house is big, expensive to maintain. We've managed for years," he nodded. "But things change," his voice softened. "I worry about you here by yourself." That explanation sounded reasonable, but something still didn't fit. "So you contacted investors?" I asked. "They buy properties quickly," he replied. "You invited them here?" "No." "Then why were they standing in the yard?" Corbin hesitated again, then he answered quietly. "Because I told them I might be ready to move forward soon." The room fell silent. "Move forward with what?" I asked. "Selling the house, to them, yes." My fingers wrapped slowly around the warm coffee mug. "Corbin, this house belongs to me." "I know, then why would you promise it to someone?" "I didn't promise it. Those men seemed to think otherwise." Corbin's voice grew more strained. "I may have told them the property would likely be available, and they decided to come wait in my backyard. I didn't tell them to do that." The tension in the room deepened. "I was trying to plan ahead," he continued. "If something ever happened to you, the house would eventually come to me." The words were logical, but the timing made my chest tighten. "So you were preparing for the day I wasn't here anymore?" Corbin looked up quickly. "That's not what I meant." But the truth had already slipped into the room. He hadn't been trying to scare me. He had simply been thinking about the future. A future where the house belonged to him. A future where investors were already waiting. And suddenly the footsteps in the yard made complete sense. Those men believed Corbin's quiet promises. They were simply checking whether the moment had arrived. Corbin sighed heavily. "I didn't think they'd actually come here, but they did." "I'll call them," he said. "Tell them to stay away." He reached for his phone. But I placed my hand gently over it. "Wait." He looked at me. "I think we should speak to them," I said. Corbin frowned. "Why?" "Because I want to hear exactly what you told them." He stared at me for a moment, then he slowly nodded. Outside the window, the afternoon light stretched across the gravel path again. The same quiet yard, the same gate, but this time the mystery was no longer hiding in the shadows. It was sitting right here at my kitchen table. Corbin stared at the phone for a long moment before unlocking it. His shoulders looked heavier than when he arrived. I could see the quiet conflict in his expression, part of him wanting to fix the situation quickly, another part realizing that whatever had been set in motion could no longer be quietly undone. "You really want to talk to them?" he asked. "Yes." "It might just make things more complicated." "They're already standing in my backyard at midnight," I said gently. "I think we're past simple." Corbin let out a slow breath, then he scrolled through his contacts and stopped at a number. "This is one of them," he said. "What's his name?" "Victor Morales." "And the other?" "His partner, Caleb." The name sounded ordinary, almost harmless. Corbin pressed the call button. The phone rang twice before a man answered. "Hello." Corbin straightened slightly. "Victor, it's Corbin Caldwell." There was a brief pause on the other end, then the man chuckled softly. "Well, I was wondering when you'd call." Corbin glanced toward me. "We need to talk." "About the house?" Victor asked. "Yes." Another small pause. "You finally ready to move forward?" Corbin's jaw tightened. "My mother is sitting right here with me." That changed the tone immediately. The man's voice became more cautious. "I see, she'd like to speak with you." Corbin handed me the phone. For a moment I simply held it, feeling the weight of the situation in my hand. Then I lifted it to my ear. "Hello," I said calmly. "Mrs. Caldwell," the man replied politely. His voice was steady, mature. Not at all like someone sneaking around yards in the middle of the night. "I believe you've been visiting my backyard," I said. A quiet sigh came through the receiver. "Yes, about that. You frightened me." "That wasn't our intention." "Then why not knock on the door like normal people?" Another pause. "We were told the situation might be delicate." I glanced at Corbin. He looked down at the table. "What exactly did my son tell you?" I asked. Victor spoke slowly now, choosing his words carefully. Corbin contacted us a few months ago, said he might be handling the sale of a property soon. My property? Yes. What made you believe it was his to sell? Because he said he expected to inherit it. The words settled into the room like quiet dust. I felt Corbin shift slightly beside me. And you thought that meant you could come wait in my yard? I continued. No, Victor said quickly. We only wanted to confirm the property and get a look at the land. At midnight, his voice softened. We didn't want to cause trouble for Corbin if the timing wasn't right yet. The strange logic of that explanation made me close my eyes briefly. So you decided the best approach was sneaking around my fence in the dark. I admit that part wasn't our best decision. Behind me, Corbin rubbed his forehead. Mrs. Caldwell, Victor continued, we never intended to pressure you. Corbin simply indicated he would likely be ready to sell once certain family matters changed. Family matters, the phrase felt cold. I knew exactly what it meant. You were waiting for me to die, I said quietly. The line went silent. Corbin's head lifted sharply. No, Victor said quickly, we would never say that. But that's what you meant. I believe Corbin was speaking hypothetically. I handed the phone back to my son. I think you should finish this conversation. Corbin swallowed and held the phone to his ear again. Victor, yes, this deal is off. There was a small pause. Are you sure? Yes. You seemed very certain a few weeks ago. Corbin glanced toward me. Well, things have changed. Victor let out a quiet breath. Understood. But one more thing, Corbin added. Yes, stay away from my mother's house. That won't be a problem. The call ended. For several seconds, the kitchen was completely silent. Corbin placed the phone on the table, then he leaned back in his chair and looked at the ceiling. I'm sorry, he said quietly. The words sounded sincere, but apologies don't erase the small cracks that form in trust. I wish you had spoken to me first, I said. I didn't want to worry you. You weren't protecting me, I replied gently. You were planning around me. Corbin didn't argue, he simply nodded. I guess I was. Outside the window, the afternoon had grown softer. The long shadows of the fence stretched across the yard, the same yard where those men had walked night after night. You thought you were being practical, I continued. Yes, preparing for the future, that's all it was. I studied my son's face. He wasn't greedy. He wasn't cruel. He had simply been thinking about life in the way younger people often do, always looking ahead, always calculating what comes next. But in doing so, he had quietly stepped past the present, past the life I was still living inside this house. I'm not angry, I said. Corbin looked up, but I am disappointed. His shoulders sank slightly. I understand, and I want you to understand something too. He nodded. This house isn't just an asset waiting for the right moment, I said softly. It's my home. Corbin's eyes softened. I know that now. The honesty in his voice felt real. For the first time since the strange noises had begun, the tension in my chest began to ease. Not everything had been broken, just misunderstood. Later that evening, Dakota stopped by to check on us. Corbin explained the situation to him while we sat on the porch. Dakota listened quietly, then he chuckled. Well, he said, that explains the midnight visitors. Corbin rubbed the back of his neck awkwardly. Sorry for the excitement. Dakota smiled kindly. At least it wasn't burglars. We all looked out across the quiet yard. The gate was closed, the gravel path still. No footsteps, no shadows, just a peaceful neighborhood settling into another ordinary night. But inside me something had shifted, because sometimes the loudest noises in life aren't footsteps outside the house. They're the quiet assumptions people make about your life when they think you aren't listening. The strange footsteps never returned after that night. The yard went back to being what it had always been, a quiet little patch of earth behind a modest house on Linden Street. The gravel lay undisturbed. The gate stayed closed, and the nights once again settled into the kind of stillness I had grown used to over the years. But something inside the house had changed, not in a bad way, just clearer. Corbin stayed for the rest of the week. At first, the air between us carried a certain awkwardness. Not hostility, not anger, just the quiet awareness that something important had been said out loud. Some truths are like that. Once spoken, they rearrange the furniture in a relationship. The first morning after his arrival, I woke up early and found him already in the kitchen. He was standing by the window, looking out at the yard with a mug of coffee in his hands. Couldn't sleep? I asked. He turned and gave a small smile. Jet lag. I poured myself some coffee and joined him at the table. For a few minutes we just sat there, listening to the soft hum of the refrigerator and the distant sound of a garbage truck down the street. Finally, Corbin spoke. "You really love this place, don't you?" I looked around the kitchen, the cabinets Thomas had built, the old clock ticking above the doorway, the faint smell of coffee and toast that seemed to live permanently in the walls. "Yes," I said simply. Corbin nodded slowly. "I think I forgot what it meant to you." His honesty felt heavier than any apology. "When you move away," he continued, "everything starts to look like numbers, property values, market trends, investments." He paused. "But standing here again, it doesn't feel like that." "No," I said gently, "it doesn't." We finished our coffee quietly. Later that morning, Corbin insisted on fixing the loose latch on the backyard gate. I watched him from the porch as he worked with a screwdriver and a small toolbox he had borrowed from Dakota. For a moment he looked exactly like Thomas had years ago, kneeling in the dirt, focused on some small repair, the same careful movements, the same quiet patience. When he finished, he tested the gate twice. "There," he said, "that should stop midnight visitors." I smiled. "I hope so." The rest of the week passed slowly. Corbin helped me around the house, cleaning the gutters, trimming the rose bushes, even repainting a section of the back fence that had faded over time. It felt strangely nice having someone else's footsteps in the house again, not the suspicious ones outside. But the familiar kind, the kind that belonged to family. One afternoon we walked down to the small diner at the end of the street, the one Corbin used to visit as a teenager. The waitress recognized him immediately. "Well, look who finally came home," she said with a grin. Corbin laughed. "I've been busy, too busy for your mother's cooking," she teased. He shook his head. "No one's cooking beats Mom's." We ordered pie and coffee, and for the first time since the strange noises had begun, everything felt normal again. But normal doesn't mean nothing was learned. A few days before Corbin returned to Seattle, we had one last conversation about the house. We were sitting on the porch at sunset. The sky glowed orange behind the maple tree, and the neighborhood was settling into its quiet evening rhythm. "I won't make decisions like that again," Corbin said. "I know, you're still the boss of this place." I smiled at the phrase, "the boss." "Absolutely." Then he hesitated slightly. "But someday, when you're ready, we should talk about the future." His tone was careful this time, respectful, not planning around me, planning with me. "That's fair," I said, "because the truth is life does move forward, houses change hands, families grow and shift, but those things should happen with honesty, not quiet assumptions." Corbin left on a Sunday morning. After his car disappeared down the street, the house became quiet again, but this time the silence didn't feel empty. It felt peaceful. That evening I stepped out into the backyard with a small cup of tea. The gravel path lay still beneath the porch light. The garden bench waited quietly near the roses, and the gate remained firmly closed. For a moment I stood there, remembering how frightened I had felt the first night I heard those footsteps, how mysterious it had seemed, how dangerous. But the truth, as it often does, turned out to be something much more human. Not criminals, not ghosts, just misunderstandings, assumptions, and a son who had been thinking too far into the future without realizing his mother was still very much living in the present. Across the street, Dakota stepped onto his porch. "Quiet night," he called. "Yes," I replied. "Let's hope it stays that way." I smiled. "I think it will." Sometimes the things that disturb our peace arrive quietly, not as loud disasters, not as dramatic betrayals. Just small footsteps in the dark that slowly reveal conversations we should have had sooner. And maybe that's the lesson I carried from those strange nights, that our lives shouldn't be planned around silence. Families should talk, ask, listen. Because assumptions, even well-intended ones, can make people feel invisible in their own homes, and no one deserves to feel like a guest in the life they built. So now I'll leave you with a small question. If you were in my place, and you discovered someone had been quietly planning your future without asking you first, what would you have done? Would you have reacted the same way I did, or would you have handled it differently? Tell me what you think. And if this story reminded you of someone, a parent, a neighbor, or even a quiet house filled with memories, then perhaps share it with them. Because sometimes the most important conversations begin with the smallest question. Just like Dakota asked me that night, "In Berlin, is everything all right at your house?"